Britain and France joining the Civil War. During the American Civil War, Britain and France considered actions that could have led to direct conflict with the United States. The Confederacy, made up of 11 southern states that broke away from the U.S. in 1861, was fighting against the rest of the country, known as the Union. Once the war began, the Union used its navy to blockade southern ports, stopping most trade in or out. This was devastating for the South, whose economy relied heavily on exporting cotton to Europe. Confederate leaders believed that if powerful nations like Britain and France officially recognized them as an independent country, those nations might intervene to force the Union to end the blockade. That would reopen the cotton trade, bring in vital weapons and supplies, and put heavy pressure on the U.S. government's ability to keep fighting. Both Britain and France officially stayed neutral, but they recognized the Confederacy as a belligerent, which means a country at war. This gave it certain rights under international law. France's Emperor Napoleon III pushed Britain to join him in a plan that could have led to recognizing the South, but President Abraham Lincoln warned that this would be treated as a declaration of war. Britain refused, even though Prime Minister Lord Palmerston personally preferred the Confederacy, knowing that supporting the South could endanger British merchant ships and risk a U.S. invasion of Canada, which was owned by Britain at the time. Tensions reached a high point later that year during the Trent Affair, when a Union ship seized 2 Confederate diplomats from a British vessel. Britain reacted angrily, sending troops to Canada and preparing for war, but the crisis was resolved through diplomacy. Also, by 1862, Britain's textile industry was suffering from a shortage of southern cotton because of the Union's blockade, but intervention still seemed too dangerous. France was more willing to help the Confederacy, partly because of Napoleon III's ambitions in Mexico, but he would not act without Britain. By 1864, Napoleon III had abandoned the idea completely due to southern defeats and rising tensions in Europe. Imperial Germany's plans. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, as Germany tried to compete with other colonial powers, its military officers secretly worked on several possible invasion plans for the United States. Between 1897 and 1903, junior officers in the Imperial German Navy prepared detailed proposals for how such an attack could happen. The goal was to put the U.S. in a weaker position, stop its growing influence in the Pacific, the Caribbean, and South America, and create opportunities for German expansion in those areas instead. The first plan was made in the winter of 1897 by Lieutenant Eberhard von Manty, and it focused on destroying America's naval strength on the East Coast. The German fleet would cross the Atlantic, defeat the U.S. Navy in a major battle, and destroy shipyards in Hampton Roads, which von Manty called the most sensitive point in America's defenses. He believed that losing this area would push the U.S. to negotiate. Then, America's victory in the Spanish-American War in 1898 changed Germany's plans. With Puerto Rico under U.S. control and Cuba strongly influenced by the U.S., Germany lost its chance to use a Caribbean base. So in March 1899, von Manty revised the plan into something more ambitious: a land invasion of New York City and Boston. A fleet of 60 warships and dozens of transport ships would carry 100,000 soldiers across the Atlantic, and the force would land at Cape Cod to move on Boston and at Sandy Hook to then attack New York. German warships would destroy harbor defenses and bomb Manhattan to cause civilian panic. However, General Alfred von Schlieffen warned that while 100,000 troops might take Boston, many more would be needed for New York, which had a population of 3 million. Carrying that many soldiers would have been problematic, as Germany didn't have enough transport ships. In December 1900, the Kaiser himself suggested launching the invasion from Cuba instead of Germany, but that would mean capturing Cuba first. Then, in 1901, Lieutenant Hubert von Reber-Paschwitz actually went to scout Cape Cod to see if it was a good landing site. He found it unsuitable for the plan and suggested moving it to Menominee Point instead, where warships could give artillery support. Using a U.S. defense report he had obtained, he also proposed a second landing at Cape Ann, north of Boston, to attack from 2 sides. Schlieffen once more doubted the plan, noting that the U.S. already knew about the area's weaknesses and could prepare its defenses before the attack. Between 1902 and 1903, we saw the final plan, when naval officer Wilhelm von Buchsel proposed creating a German naval base in Culebra, in Puerto Rico, to threaten the Panama Canal, but conditions were changing. The U.S. Navy was growing after its victory over Spain. Britain's Royal Navy was getting stronger, and Germany was falling behind in the naval arms race. Also, in Europe, the 1904 Entente Cordiale between Britain and France made a European war more likely than an attack on America, so by 1906, Germany had abandoned the invasion plans. They remained secret until 1970, when historian Holger H. Herwig found them in the German military archives in Freiburg. Zimmermann Telegram Plan. In January 1917, during World War I, the German Foreign Office sent a secret-coded telegram from State Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to Germany's ambassador in Mexico. Germany was preparing to restart unrestricted submarine warfare, knowing this would likely bring the United States into the war against them. The telegram instructed that if war with the US became certain, the ambassador should propose a military alliance with Mexico. In return, Germany promised financial support and agreed that Mexico could try to take back Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, which were territories it had lost to the US in the 1800s. The goal was to force the US into a war with Mexico, slowing American aid to Britain and France and giving Germany more time to win in Europe. British codebreakers in Room 40 intercepted and decrypted the telegram, thanks to earlier captures of German codebooks, but revealing it created a problem. If they showed it to the US, Germany would know Britain could read its messages and was monitoring American communications. To protect their secret, the British got another copy of the telegram from the Mexican Telegraph Office and claimed this was their source. They then gave the telegram to the American government. President Woodrow Wilson was careful at first, as many Americans thought it might be a British forgery meant to pull the US into the war, but doubts disappeared when Zimmermann himself confirmed that the message was genuine. By that time, German submarines had already sunk American ships, further angering the public, so the US Congress declared war on Germany. Mexico, however, rejected the proposal. President Venustiano Carranza had his generals study it, and they decided Mexico could not win such a war. The country was in the middle of a civil conflict. Its military was weaker than the US, and even if it regained the lost territories, it would have trouble controlling the large English-speaking populations living there. Furthermore, German financial support was uncertain, and attacking the US would harm Mexico's relations with other Latin American countries. The Amerikabomber. In the late 1930s, Nazi Germany began exploring the idea of bombing the United States, especially New York City, directly from Europe. This became known as the Amerikabomber project. The goal was to create a long-range bomber that could fly the 7,200 miles round trip without refueling. The idea first came up in 1938 after a Focke-Wulf 200 Condor made a non-stop Berlin-New York flight, proving that the distance was possible. Hitler liked the idea, and Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring complained that Germany had no bomber able to do it, so German aircraft companies were asked to work on designs. Hitler even considered using Portugal's Azores Islands as a staging base, but by 1943, Britain had leased the islands, ending that option. By April 1942, a formal plan suggested using 3 different airplanes, each carrying about 3.3 to 7.2 US tons of bombs. The main targets were US industrial plants, especially those making aircraft engines, aluminum, and precision parts. German planners hoped such raids would force the US to move air defenses away from Britain, giving the Luftwaffe an advantage in Europe. 2 prototypes were built, but modern research shows that the famous claims that it reached the US coast in 1944 were false. Another idea was Eugen Senger's Silbervogel, a rocket-powered suborbital bomber that could theoretically strike anywhere in the world, though it stayed a concept. In reality, the plan faced serious problems because Germany had trouble producing reliable engines and suffered resource shortages, made worse by Allied bombing. Even if a bomber had made it to the US, its small bomb load would have caused little lasting damage, and Germany had no nuclear weapons program to make the mission decisive. By the end of the war, the Amerikabomber was dropped as too costly and unrealistic, even though some designs influenced post-war projects. For example, Senger's Silbervogel inspired early spaceplane concepts, including ideas that led to the space shuttle. Canada's pre-emptive attack. In 1921, Canadian officer Lieutenant Colonel James Sutherland Brown created Defense Scheme No. 1, a secret plan for a surprise Canadian invasion of the United States. It was only meant for one scenario, if war broke out between the US and the British Empire. His plan called for Canadian forces to strike first, moving quickly into the northern US before America could attack in full strength. The goal wasn't to hold US territory, but to delay American advances, buying time for Canada and for Britain to send help. In the West, Canadian troops would target Seattle, Spokane, and Portland. From Winnipeg, forces would head south to capture Fargo and Great Falls, then move toward Minneapolis. From Quebec, troops would aim for Albany, while units from the Maritimes would move into Maine. After hitting these targets, the Canadians would retreat, destroying bridges and rail lines to slow pursuit. Between 1921 and 1926, Brown and other officers secretly crossed the border in plain clothes to scout terrain, roads, railways, and river crossings. He even hypothesized that some Americans, frustrated with their government during Prohibition, might be sympathetic to Britain and Canada. Supporters like General George Parks saw the plan as risky but possibly effective, while critics called it unrealistic and suicidal. Brown hadn't coordinated with Britain, which had no intention of sending a large army, meaning Canada's best troops could be lost with little result. Others argued that defending key ports was far more important than launching raids into the US in 1928. New Chief of the General Staff Andrew McNaughton cancelled the plan in order to keep US-British relations peaceful. It was later revealed that the US also had a counterpart to this plan, War Plan Red, developed in 1930, which outlined a US invasion of Canada in a similar situation, Operation AL. This one actually happened, but since it wasn't on the US mainland, I still wanted to include it. In June 1942, Japan invaded two remote Alaskan islands, Attu and Kiska, in an operation called Operation AL. It was the first time since the War of 1812 against the British that part of the continental United States had been occupied by a foreign power. The goals were to extend Japan's patrol area in the North Pacific, stop the US from building forward air bases, and prevent strikes on Japan itself. On the 7th of June 1942, 1,140 Japanese troops under Major Matsutoshi Hozumi landed on Attu without resistance, and the island's 42 Aleut villagers and 2 Americans, Charles and Etta Jones, were captured. Charles, a radio operator, destroyed his equipment so the Japanese couldn't use it and was executed. On the 11th of May 1943, though, US forces landed in harsh Arctic weather to retake the island. Fighting was intense and ended on the 29th of May with a huge Japanese banzai charge, one of the largest of the Pacific War. US forces suffered heavy losses, but nearly the entire Japanese force was killed, and only 29 surrendered. This ended the Japanese occupation of US soil. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or join my Discord to suggest another.